Okay, we are at 10 a.m. So even though we still have attendees coming in, we're going to get started. And that way, those who come in later will be able to see this. We're going to record this. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, Reopening City and Town Hall Legal Considerations and Best Practices. My name is Matt Lohr. I'm with the League of Arizona Cities and Towns. And we decided to coordinate this webinar in response to many questions that we had coming in to us as a league. And we know that many of you, cities and towns, are grappling with questions also as we reopen our city and town halls. So we wanted to do this webinar in response to many of those questions. As I just mentioned, we're going to be recording this webinar. So we'll send a link to all those who signed up for the webinar. You'll get a link and you'll get the presentations will be included with that email. In addition, we will put this on our website so you can go back to it at a later time, or you can share it with others, and that will have the link to the webinar itself, as well as the presentations from our presenters. For those of you that are city and town attorneys, we will be offering CLE credits for this. So when I send the information out to all the attendees, we will include the CLE form. So city and town attorneys, you can use this webinar for CLE credits. Before we get started, I'm gonna briefly introduce our panelists today. To talk about some of the legal issues, we have members of the firm Pierce Coleman, PLLC. Steve Coleman is a founding member of Pierce Coleman, PLLC. His practice focuses on the representation of management side clients in all facets of employment law. Steve graduated cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania with a BS in economics from the Wharton School of Business and a BA in political science from the School of Arts and Science. He received his JD cum laude from Georgetown University Law Center. In addition, we have Justin Pierce, who is also a founding member of Pierce Coleman, PLLC. Justin is the contract city and town attorney for the cities of El Mirage and Tolleson, as well as the towns of Payson and Parker. In addition, Justin also served in the Arizona House of Representatives from 2011 to 2015. So he's well versed on both sides of the aisle, from staff to elected official. And lastly, from Pierce Coleman, PLLC, we have Aaron Arntzen. He serves as the town attorney for the town of Fountain Hills and also as counsel for several municipalities on various municipal law issues, including land use, zoning, open meeting law, public records, and general contract issues. From the town of Gilbert, we have Leah Hubbard Reinheimer, who joined the town of Gilbert in 2011 and currently serves as the deputy town manager. And in that role, she oversees the Gilbert Police, Fire, Public Works, and Parks and Recreation departments, as well as the town's Safety Division and Native American Management Internship Program. Before that, she served as the assistant to the town manager in Gilbert and as the director of intergovernmental relations for Gilbert. We also have from the town of Gilbert, Mary Goodman, who is also a deputy town manager in Gilbert, where she oversees finance and management services, information technology, Office of Management and Budget, development services, water resources, community development block grants, and emergency management department. She joined the town in 2013, serving first as a management and budget analyst and later as an assistant to the town manager. Before joining Gilbert, Mary worked for the League of Arizona Cities and Towns, so we've worked with her, and she also worked at a local PR firm specializing in hospitality, real estate, and B2B technology. And lastly, we have Jay Davies. Jay is with the city of Peoria, and he has been with the city for over 22 years. He currently serves as the chief of staff to the city manager, where he manages a wide array of the city's strategic initiatives. Jay received his master's degree in public administration from ASU and is a graduate of Northwestern University's School of Police Command. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists and thank you for taking the time to do this today. Before we get started, I just wanted to get some ground rules for our webinar today. First, we're going to hear from Justin and his team regarding some of the legal aspects. Following their presentation, we will take questions for them. And to ask your questions, you'll see either at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen, on your toolbar, it should say Q&A. Please post your questions there and we'll take them in a first come, first serve manner. Once we take some questions for Justin and his team, we might not get to all of your questions, but we're going to go then to our cities and towns. So we'll hear from the town of Gilbert, and then we'll hear from the city of Peoria. And then once everybody has talked, we will then open the discussion back up to questions from the audience. And again, I will remind you on how to ask your questions. You want to go to the Q&A panel and ask your question that way, and we'll take them in a first come, first serve manner. If you have any technical difficulties, there is a chat section, and I would ask that you write in the chat section the difficulties you're having, and we'll try to resolve those. Also, we have a number of people on this webinar today, so if we don't get to all your questions, then I would ask that you email me at mlore@azleague.org, either after this presentation or really at any time, and we will try to find the appropriate answer for you or the appropriate person to answer those questions. So that's some of the ground rules. With that, we'll get started with our webinar, and we'll begin with the folks from Pierce Coleman, PLLC. And so Justin, I will turn it over to you and your folks. And Justin, you are still muted.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And now I've got Aaron off screen. He is now 6 feet apart from me to ensure we're doing this the right way. I didn't want to have us both on screen and have some people heckle us and say, why are you so close together? Just for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. And I get the right one. There we go. Okay, you should have a PowerPoint in front of you. Excited to be here with our folks, with the panel. It's a crazy time. I can't believe we're doing this the way we're doing this. I've only done a handful of webinars before under very different circumstances, so this one feels different. Part of what feels different about it, I think, and we're going to talk about some of the legal issues associated with reopening city and town halls, is that I venture to say that there's nobody on this webinar that can really speak from experience and precedent on the issues that we're facing, which makes it both difficult and easy, of course, because anything that we say, I can put a caveat on there and say that tomorrow things could change. We've seen guidance come out from different agencies over the past several weeks that have been trying to implement new federal laws and other things, and it seems like the goalposts move, and we find ourselves consistently updating our guidance and saying, okay, well, now this is the way we could probably go. So happy, obviously, to answer any questions along the way. We will do that here, but as Matt said, also after the fact, please feel free to send additional questions along if there's some things that you wanted to cover specifically. And there may be some questions that may require some more in-depth analysis and discussion, and we can do that as well. I wanted to start just by talking about the Opening Up America Again plan, which kind of serves as the baseline for why we're here and where we're at. And I think everybody understands that we're in this phase one, which is limited and cautious reopening measures part of the plan, and that's because we've got the downward trajectory of documented COVID cases and those sorts of things, which is all very good news, but it leaves open a whole lot of questions which we've been dealing with, and Steve will address some of these employment issues. But 10 minutes before this webinar started, I received an email from one of our friends. I don't even know if you're on this webinar. I won't name names for obviously confidential reasons, but a question that came up with regard to an employee who doesn't want to participate in COVID testing based on some religious issues and requesting a religious accommodation. And so the issues and the questions are myriad and continue to evolve and change. And so Steve will talk to you about some of those employment issues. In fact, as part of the limited and cautious reopening plan, I'm going to talk to you just for a few minutes. We want to leave plenty of time for questions about some of the general liability issues that we're seeing and some of the advice that we've been giving along the way. And then Steve will take some time to talk about some of the returning to work and employee safety issues, which I think are some of the biggest issues. And that's not just because we're primarily employment lawyers, but because when this thing hit, as you all know, the biggest thing that Congress did and took on had to do with employment. Between the unemployment issue as well as the Family First Act that went into effect, all had to do with employee leave, and there were just so many questions that came up as a result of it. And now that people are coming back to work, there are a whole lot of questions that are continuing in that realm. So Steve will talk to you primarily about those issues and take kind of a few minutes on that. And then I know a lot of you folks have been doing your public meetings either via Zoom, or many have continued to hold their public meetings and have had council members in person attend the meetings that sit far enough apart and restrict access to the public because there have been other access via television or streaming or other things. There are a whole lot of different ways that's been going, but now that we're into a phase 1 and hopefully moving into a phase 2 soon, many of you guys are starting to reopen the public meeting portions as well in different ways. And so Aaron will talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that are coming as a result of that. So I thought maybe we could just start with on the general liability issues. This is a question that I've just seen and had many times already is, okay, are we liable if we reopen and someone contracts COVID? And as you know, the answer, the lawyer answer, which I know there's a lot of lawyers on this call or on this conference. I'm assuming it's most likely because so many of the conferences and things were canceled that everyone's having a heck of a time trying to figure out how to get your CLE in, and this is a great way to get it. So hopefully you can get some good CLE, and hopefully I can provide some good input. I know that you've been dealing with these questions as well, and by all means are probably more versed than even than I am. But the answer to me is it depends. That's the lawyer answer. The other answer I thought about putting here was who the heck knows, because again we're dealing with just such an unprecedented situation. But I think that as it pertains to reopening and somebody contracting COVID and coming back to a city or town and saying, hey, you're responsible, it's probably going to turn on a couple of things. One is if it's an employee, and again, Steve will cover some of this stuff, but the workers' compensation system in Arizona is the exclusive remedy for on-the-job injuries, and unless there's willful misconduct, which I've also included there as a definition, an act done knowingly and purposefully with the object of injuring another. It seems to me this is not going to apply at all. That reopening city and town halls, even with claims that we shouldn't be yet, maybe there's still risk out there. I don't see that falling outside of the workers' compensation system. If an employee were contracted and have an issue and come back on the city or town and say, hey, I think you're responsible. You made me come back to work, and you shouldn't have made me come back to work. I'm going to cover a couple of little things that I think could impact that, the issue of whether or not there is willful misconduct there. Again, it's remote, but I think there are some things that I think could play into that. Really, it probably comes down more to customers and members of the public that may be coming back to the city or town hall. And there, I think there is a greater risk of a negligence claim, even wrongful death claim, if somebody comes back and claims that they contracted COVID-19 as a result of things that happened at the city through the reopening. As I think most of you know, that government entities have certain immunities that are in statute. I printed out the immunity statute here. Excuse me, the absolute immunity statute. I'm not sure that we're really going to get a lot of protection out of this, and that's primarily because this would protect an administrative function that involves the determination of fundamental governmental policy, and that's really going to be tied to discretionary decisions on what to fund and where to put resources. One of those is the provision of governmental services, but I think that the analysis really probably turns on the allocation of resources toward the provision of governmental services and not necessarily the reopening. However, you could make the argument that, well, the resources that we're allocating, some, we have resources for certain PPE equipment, for certain barriers and other things. And if somebody's claiming you didn't put up necessary barriers, you didn't put up required things that you should have done, there's, I think, at least an argument to be made that, well, that's an allocation of municipal government resources, and those decisions are entitled to immunity in these situations. So it's, again, I think it's something we don't have a lot of precedent in, but hopefully we can take some measures and do some things that mitigate the possibility of those claims coming up in the first place. And so I've covered some of those because we really can't eliminate all of the risks unless we don't reopen. And we're here to talk about reopening. So the way to eliminate the risk is keep everything closed and don't allow anybody access, don't do anything. But that's not realistic. We're here to talk about how to reopen. And so let's talk about mitigating the risk. You're going to hear some really good things. I've already been privy to some of it from friends in the town of Gilbert and in the city of Peoria. This is some things that they have done. I've seen other plans from other municipalities, some that we've worked with as well, that I think are really good measures to develop a plan and lay out a plan with guidance. The league has provided a document that I think is very good as well, implementing recent CDC and related guidance. Some key points would be to restrict employees and public in the way that they access the facilities. If it's possible to work from home or to conduct activities remotely for the public, I think we're still in a position where even the federal guidance says let's do that. And it used to be that we took a much harder line position on attendance in the workplace, for example, and the requirement that is an essential function of the job. I think we're going to have to make some adjustments there and really look differently at how a job can be done and whether or not we really can accommodate that. And Steve will talk about the accommodation portion of it in the sense of what we need to do for an employee who's requesting an accommodation. But I'm also talking about making that accommodation so that we are reducing the level of risk because we're not having as many people in the workplace so that when the public comes, they're interfacing with fewer people as well. So I think it's important for us to make that analysis and not be too set in our ways to say, no, this has always been done with somebody here, therefore we need to continue to have somebody here. Take a critical look at that and see, are there things we can do to help keep people away as much as possible during this time that will help spread the potential contact as well, which I put there as the next bullet point, which is implementing a no contact and physical barriers policy and putting those things in place, including protective equipment as much as possible. You can consider temperature checks and testing for employees, particularly those that have high interaction with the public. And some things that we've done for several municipalities is we've revamped some of the waivers that are being issued as part of events and facility usage. For example, I know a municipality that is at least so far figuring by the middle of the summer they're going to be able to do a particular event that's a race event of some sort, and we've revamped that waiver to include specific language relating to essentially assumption of the risk as it pertains to the potential for COVID-19 specifically, but we've also kind of not pigeonholed ourselves into that because who knows what the next communicable disease is going to be. And so we've adjusted that language to create some waivers so that people are expressly accepting the risk associated with that. And I think that that's an important thing to do so that somebody can't, and again, waivers, signs at City Hall, other things that say, while we have taken particular cautions and measures, there's no way for us to be able to take complete caution and put that on people so that they can't come into a place and say, hey, I figured since you opened back up that it must be safe for me. And I figure that's probably what some of the claims will be in things like senior centers and rec centers, which those waivers I think are going to be really important there. And to the extent possible, and I realize this is a political analysis as well for cities and towns to determine whether reopening those places that tend to have more possibility for exposure, and again, senior centers and rec centers are probably the ones that come to mind the most as it relates to that. So those waivers and notices and things that should a claim come down the road, being able to come back and say, look, we notified people, we did the best that we could, but we obviously understood that there was no way we were going to be able to completely eliminate the risk here, and for people to continue to participate in the risk in there. With that, I was going to say, I'm not going to take questions yet, right? I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk about some of these workplace issues, and then again, Ellen will go, and then we'll throw it back over to Matt to hit on some of these questions. I will mute myself right now.
All right, thanks, Justin. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So I'm going to talk about some of the issues with employees returning to the workplace. One of the most common questions that we've received is, what do we do if there's an employee who's just uncomfortable coming back to work? How do you manage that situation? And the first thing you want to do is initiate a dialogue with that employee to find out the reasons for their concern, because that's going to help you determine what, if anything, your legal obligations are. So for example, one reason an employee might be afraid to return is that that person has a medical condition that makes them particularly vulnerable to a severe case of COVID-19. For instance, an employee could be on chemotherapy and have a compromised immune system. They could have diabetes or a respiratory illness. So if an employee discloses to you that that's the reason why they would be uncomfortable returning to the workplace, you may have an obligation at that point to provide a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so what you would do in that scenario is you would give the employee an ADA questionnaire to take to their doctor, have their doctor tell you what the diagnosis is, what the restrictions there are on the person's ability to come to the workplace and do their job, and make recommendations for possible accommodations to minimize the risk. And so some possible accommodations may be implementing additional measures for physical separation, like beyond just your normal social distancing, putting somebody in an area where you give them, they ordinarily wouldn't have their own office, but maybe giving somebody an office, or putting them in an area where they have less traffic, where there's less traffic with other employees. Could be installing plexiglass or plastic barriers, providing an air purifier, or it might even be an accommodation, might be an extension of the ability to work from home. And if a person can't work from home and there's no way to safely accommodate them in the workplace, it may be necessary under the ADA to give somebody a leave of absence. And that leave of absence could potentially extend until the situation is stabilized, or perhaps even until a vaccine is developed. But the important thing is that you recognize that if an employee tells you that they don't want to come to work and it's medically related, that you may have obligations to go through the ADA process. One thing to note is I've had some clients ask, can we just tell anybody who's in the CDC high-risk categories, like everybody over 65 or everybody with a certain medical condition puts them at risk, that they're not allowed to return to work because we don't want to put their health in jeopardy? You're not allowed to impose restrictions on people based on age or disability, even if you're doing it for benevolent reasons and to protect them. You can ask employees in those categories if they need an accommodation or if they want to continue teleworking, but at the end of the day, it's their decision. You can't put restrictions on, even if it is for for good reasons. The employees will have to make their own choice about whether or not they want to take the risk of coming to the workplace, or if they want to seek out an accommodation or a leave. So if we could move to the next slide, please, Justin. So now there might be a scenario when an employee says they don't want to come back to work, and it's not because of a medical condition. It's just because they have a generalized fear that they don't want to be around people. They think perhaps we're reopening too early. So under that scenario, you don't have any ADA applicability, but you'll probably want to ask some questions and try to figure out what are the employees' concerns, what are they afraid of, and what are their fears, and then explain to them the safety measures that the city or town has implemented to help protect its workforce. Talk about personal protective equipment, sanitization, social distancing, and see if that makes them comfortable knowing that you're doing everything right to protect the workforce. Now, one important thing to note is that under OSHA and the Arizona counterpart, an employee can refuse to come to work if that employee has a reasonable belief that there's a safety hazard in the workplace that presents an imminent risk of serious physical harm or death. Now, I don't think just a general fear of I don't want to come to work because COVID-19 exists meets that standard. But if an employee came forward and raised concerns about perhaps a supervisor that's requiring the subordinates to work together, shoulder to shoulder, not social distance, not use personal protective equipment when they're doing so. And so you've got employees that are very close to each other, and perhaps people are sneezing and coughing. A report like that could meet the OSHA standard of a report of a risk of likely or serious physical harm or death. So if somebody makes that type of report, you can't force them to come back to the workplace until that threat is eliminated. So you have to take steps to make sure that everybody is adhering to all the social distancing guidelines and other safety requirements that are in place. Now, if you do have an employee and they have a generalized fear that's not medically related and they're not raising any specific safety concerns, then you can require that employee to report to work and tell them that if they don't report to work, then if they're going to be absent without authorization, and they can be disciplined for it, and they can be eventually terminated for it. Now, every employer has to make their own choice. There's some employers that have decided that they're not going to discipline anybody who's not comfortable, and they're just going to give people some leeway because this is very unusual times and allow people to just take an unpaid leave if they're not comfortable. But there's other employers who have taken the position that, we need people for operational reasons. And if somebody is refusing to report to work without good reason, we are going to hold them accountable, and will eventually discipline and possibly terminate if they don't come back. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, I want to talk about some things that you're allowed to do to help ensure that you're providing a safe workplace. Now, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are restrictions on an employer's ability to require that an employee have a medical examination, or to even ask any questions that would reveal medical information. And the general standard is that you can only require an employee to have a medical examination or make medical inquiries if the employer has a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that that employee has a medical condition that would restrict their ability to safely perform their job or present a direct threat to the health or safety of others. So that would be something like an individual, what I like to think of as an individualized suspicion, like an employee who you find has a seizure and they operate, heavy equipment in public works. You would be able to send them for a medical examination to determine what's their condition and do they present a risk. Well, here, because of the pandemic, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has relaxed this rule. They're no longer requiring that there be some sort of individualized suspicion for you to require ask questions or require medical examinations relating to COVID-19. So here's some of the things that you're allowed to do. You can ask employees if they're experiencing any of the symptoms of COVID-19, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, loss of taste, fever, any of those. I know some employers that have a checklist, and they ask the employers to review it every morning and say if they answer yes to any of the questions about are they experiencing symptoms, then they're immediately sent home. You can take employees' temperatures. If you're going to do this, you just need to make sure that it should be done by somebody with some type of medical training, like perhaps an EMT or a paramedic. And that person who's taking the temperature should have on a mask or other personal protective equipment. And you should, of course, use a touchless thermometer so that you're not, touching people. And so I know a lot of cities and towns have required people in public safety to have their temperature taken at the start of every shift, in particular because those are folks who are going to have some contact with the public that's going to be unavoidable. So that's something else that you can do that ordinarily would not be allowed, but the EOC has permitted it because of the pandemic. Now, let's talk about briefly what to do if somebody does experience symptoms of COVID-19. So they have a fever, they have difficulty breathing. So the CDC provides guidance. They update it from time to time, so it's always good to check what the most recent guidance is. But for now, what they're recommending is that the employee be required to stay home until they are symptom-free without the use of medication for at least 72 hours. So they shouldn't be taking Tylenol to bring their fever down, but so symptom-free without medication for 72 hours, and it has to have been at least 10 days since the symptoms first started. So that's the return to work criteria for somebody who has symptoms of COVID-19. As an alternative, if an employee has 2 negative COVID-19 tests that are 24 hours apart, then that's another basis for being able to return to work. Now, if somebody takes a COVID-19 test and they test positive, then you have some steps you need to do as an employer besides sending that employee home. What you have to do is start to begin basically contact tracing, meaning you'll want to speak to that employee over the phone or via email and find out anybody else that they were in close proximity to that they may have exposed, so you can notify those people. Now, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are medical confidentiality requirements, so you're not allowed to share the identity of any employee who's tested positive. But what you can and are required to do is reach out to anybody they may have exposed, and without identifying the employee who's positive, tell them, we've now learned that you were in close contact with somebody who's tested positive, and so we need to send you home, and we need you to self-quarantine for a period of 14 days because of the possibility that it may have been transmitted to you. So that's how you would handle the situation with a positive test, is notify the other people and send them home for that 14-day incubation period to make sure they haven't also contracted COVID-19. I'll tell you, I've gotten some questions sometimes that sort of along these lines, that an employee's spouse works with somebody who tested positive. And employers, what do we do? People are nervous, they're panicking. They heard that, Joe's wife works at a place where somebody's positive. And do you send Joe home automatically? And the answer for that is the CDC has come out with a risk threat analysis where they look at certain criteria to determine whether it's necessary to have somebody quarantined. And so the questions you would ask, just because somebody worked at a place where somebody's positive doesn't necessarily mean they were exposed. You'd want to know, okay, did Joe's wife work in close proximity with the person who's positive? Perhaps they work in a building that's 5 stories tall and they don't even work on the same floor, or they work in completely different departments. If they didn't work in close proximity, there's no real risk. And then in terms of risk of transmission, the CDC says it's very low risk unless you've been closer than 6 feet to somebody who's positive for at least 10 minutes. So if people work in a workplace where there is, good social distancing and people perhaps pass each other in the hallway, that doesn't present a high risk scenario where you need to send somebody home. It would only be if you found out that Joe's wife, worked very closely for less than 6 feet for an extended period of time, then maybe you have to send Joe home because he's probably been exposed to his wife and have that person stay home for the 14-day incubation period. Now, something else that you can do is you can actually require an employee to take a COVID-19 test to see whether or not they're positive before allowing them to return to work. Now, if we could go to the next slide, I want to say a few more things about testing. So any test that's used has to be accurate and reliable. Usually that's certified by the FDA, because there are a lot of, I think, private companies now selling tests that aren't necessarily, reputable. So if you're going to require a test, make sure it's accurate and reliable. Now, there are two types of tests out there. There are tests for whether or not a person is currently positive for COVID-19. Those tests are permitted because if somebody is currently positive, they would present a direct threat to the safety of their coworkers. Now, there's a second kind of test, and that's the serology or antibody test. And that test actually, in some regards, is more useful than the test for present infection. That test will tell you whether or not somebody had COVID-19 in the past and developed antibodies that may give them immunity. And so that can be very useful information to know which employees perhaps now are at lower risk because they may have developed immunity. Well, under the current EEOC guidelines, employers would not be allowed to require employees to take the antibody test because the information that test gives you, whether or not somebody had a past infection, isn't relevant to determining if they pose a current threat to workers. So employees can certainly voluntarily go get tested, and they can volunteer to share the results of their antibody test, but you cannot require somebody, at least under the current state of the law as interpreted by the EEOC, to have an antibody test. If we can move on now, next, other things employers can do is require people to wear personal protective equipment. The OSHA has come out with requirements that you can review, and they've classified jobs as either low risk, medium risk, or high risk. Low risk meaning you have no contact with the public, and you're never closer than 6 feet from a coworker. And those people generally don't need personal protective equipment, but they should obviously still wash their hands frequently, sanitize their workplace. For people who are in medium risk, that's where there's going to be some unavoidable contact with the public, and perhaps sometimes where you might be closer than 6 feet. The OSHA recommends that those people have gloves, masks, or other appropriate personal protective equipment. And importantly, the employer is required to pay for the cost of that equipment, to provide it, and to train people on the proper use of personal protective equipment. If we can go to the next slide, please. One thing to be aware of is that there may be some employees who have a disability that makes them have an allergy to latex, or a respiratory disability that makes it difficult for them to use a face mask. And there also may be people who have perhaps a religious objection to taking a COVID-19 test. So if any of those scenarios comes up, you'll need to consider whether or not you can give it some sort of accommodation, like a modified mask, non-latex gloves, or other types of modified PPE to accommodate that person's medical condition or that person's religious belief. And then I just want to talk briefly about some categories of leave that are available. So as we all know, different people have different experiences with COVID-19. Some people are asymptomatic, some people have the same symptoms as just an ordinary cold, and some people have very severe symptoms and even hospitalization. So for the people who have severe cases of COVID-19, that have to stay home with serious symptoms for at least 3 consecutive days, or that perhaps are hospitalized, they would qualify for leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act for a serious health condition. So that's one you don't want to let slip through the cracks, that if you're aware of an employee's positive in their home, make sure you give them the notice of their FMLA leave and have them fill out the certification form and track their leave as qualifying under the FMLA. Another option for leave is paid sick leave under the Arizona's paid sick leave law. That could apply even if the person's staying home just because they have a cold, they haven't seen a healthcare provider, but they're just not coming into work. They can use their paid sick leave. You can allow employees to take their traditional PTO or vacation time. And then the last category, which is the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, which created 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave for certain qualifying reasons, which could be a person's been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, a person needs to stay home to care for a child whose school or place of daycare has closed, a person is getting a COVID-19 test, that can qualify for 80 hours of paid sick leave. And then there's a new expanded FMLA category where somebody can get up to 12 weeks of leave to care for a child whose school or place of care has closed. Those categories of leave, I'm not going to go into too much detail. We're happy to take questions on them. We're effective April 1, so I think most people have sort of gotten the hang of it by now, and they'll remain in place until December 31st of this year. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Aaron, who's going to talk about public meetings and reopening town hall.
Thanks, Steve. I see from our chat function here that there was a number of questions that have come in about employment-related subjects. So I'll move through my portion quickly to make sure that we can respond to those questions. But one other major component of bringing people back is not just the employment side, but bringing people, inviting the public and customers back into city and town halls to transact business, to attend public meetings, etc. Most of our city and town halls were, of course, closed to the public or had very limited public access. We're starting to see several city and town halls reopening and reopening to the public on a limited basis. The critical question here is, how do we strike the balance between the right to be in public areas with the need to limit access to prevent the spread of communicable disease, particularly COVID-19? And I know that our friends over in Gilbert and Peoria are going to talk about some of the physical mechanics of what they've done and how they're implementing those things. So one thing that we can focus on sort of narrowly here is reopening facilities to the public for the purpose of attending meetings. Everyone on this call is familiar with the open meeting law. Requires that the public body hold meetings in a way that's accessible to the public, that the public be able to view the meeting. Although the public doesn't have a right to participate in public meetings, they have a right to attend. And however, there are certain actions like zoning actions, certain code amendments that may vary from city to city and town to town, at which the public has a statutory or other right to speak. A lot during the pandemic, what we saw was a lot of cities and towns putting off those more controversial public hearing items or those more controversial items so that they wouldn't draw a lot of public attendance to minimize the effect of having those closed meetings to the public. We saw a lot of suspension of calls to the public and where possible those delayed items. But we can't delay those forever, of course. We're now seeing municipalities that are restarting their meetings and reopening them to the public. So the suggestions that we have for those are largely those that you're already familiar with. And I'd be interested to know what those in our participants are doing. What we've seen is folks limiting capacity, arranging council chambers to ensure that social distancing guidelines can be observed. We're continuing to encourage the public to observe via live stream and cable access. That's been, thank goodness, a great resource that we've had available to us for the most part during this time, where the public has been able to stay safe in the comfort of their own home
and still see what's going on with their elected officials. In a couple of our cities that we represent, we've seen council members, if the meeting hasn't been canceled outright, we've seen council members participating remotely as well, and city management asking that only essential staff attend those meetings. In terms of public hearing items, I think the key here is advising the public on what to expect. We had actually a public hearing item that ended up going pretty well before Planning and Zoning Commission in one of our municipalities. Controversial item, expected to draw a lot of individuals to speak, in this case, out against the project. And staff simply worked with a group of the neighbors that he had been in contact with for some time. The Development Services Director advised them that, we're going to have limited capacity in the council chamber. We're not exactly sure how this was going to go, given that it's their first time back. Can you take that into account? And in this instance, the public was particularly accommodating. The neighbors actually kind of banded together and decided that they would designate a certain number of individuals to attend to sort of speak on behalf of the neighbors. So I think advising the public on what to expect online, letting them know that there might be our capacity is going to be limited in some respects and that we'll have restrictions is the key. And we've actually found that people have been relatively understanding. Not to say that will happen in every instance, but communication is the key. We have encouraged written comments online and at the door. Before the meeting, we've given options for comments. I know that some municipalities are giving options for comments by phone or by Zoom. I've heard mixed reviews on that, so I'd be interested to know what your experiences have been. Certainly encouraging written comments online and at the door. Written comments only has proven helpful and effective for us in managing the public's desire to provide input and certainly to exercise their ability to make comments during public hearing time. That's what I have for this portion. I see that there were a number of questions coming in. So Matt, maybe I'll turn it back over to you so that we can get those questions answered and resolved, and we're happy to answer them as we're able.
All right, thank you guys. Yeah, we do have a number of questions coming in. So we'll take those in the order that they came in. And just to remind everybody, if you have a question, please go to the Q&A. The chat section is really just for technical issues. There was a question asked in the technical section, in the chat section, but please go to the Q&A. And so we'll start to go down these questions right now, and we'll take these. If we don't get to all of them due to time, because we have to hear from Gilbert and Peoria, we'll capture them at the end. So the first question was, does ADA cover accommodations for those without childcare or who are afraid to take their children to an older / at-risk grandparent who typically watches the children?
I'll answer that one. So the ADA does not require any accommodations for childcare issues. The ADA only requires accommodations for the employee's medical condition that rises to the level of a disability. However, under the new expanded FMLA that was passed as part of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, there is leave available for an employee who needs to care for a child under the age of 18 whose school or child care is unavailable. So if the child would normally be in school, be in a summer camp, be in a daycare, and that school or summer or a camp or daycare is closed, that would be a qualifying reason for an employee to take up to 12 weeks of partially paid leave under the new law. Under the scenario where the parent is afraid to bring the child to a grandparent, that would not qualify, because that does not mean that the child care provider is unavailable. Now, if the situation were reversed and the grandparent usually watches the child and the grandparent says, I'm afraid to do so because I know there's a lot of asymptomatic children who are carriers and I'm in an at-risk category, well, now your child care provider is unavailable, and that would be a qualifying reason to take up to 12 weeks of leave under the new law.
All right, thank you. The next question was, why an EMT to take employee's temp, it will take an EMT out of service?
So this is not a legal requirement. This is just a recommendation. And the reason why it's recommended is partly because, if you ask an employee, you ask Sally, the receptionist, and say, you're now going to take everybody's temperature. Number one, Sally might be squeamish about that and say, wait, I don't want to do this. And like, why am I the person who's got the short straw? Usually an EMT or somebody training is going to be less squeamish and more comfortable with that scenario. And they know they have the right equipment. And they know they're not doing anything that's creating an undue risk. It also gives a little bit more confidence in the people that are having their temperature taken to see that it's being done by somebody with medical training and not, the receptionist. So, but that being said, it is not a legal requirement. If you want to designate, some other person and to do it because you're concerned about an EMT being, taken off the street, then you can certainly do that, and that wouldn't be any type of violation of the law.
Okay, the next question is, what if an employee tests positive and could have exposed the entire organization? Do we send all employees home for the 14-day quarantine?
I'll take this one as well. So this is one where you really have to go by the CDC's, risk assessment. And really there's only a risk if you are closer than 6 feet to somebody who's positive for 10 minutes or longer, and not using personal protective equipment such as a face shield or a mask. So if you're practicing good social distancing, then the likelihood that somebody has exposed the entire organization is probably very remote. I mean, it would have to be a workplace that's completely, I think, disregarding it for everybody to have been in such close proximity for 10 minutes or longer and without using any personal protective equipment. If that were the scenario, then yeah, the recommendation would be that everybody needs to self-quarantine, but I just think that's a very unlikely scenario.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can the employer request that employees take their own temperature at home before coming to work and not come to work if over 100?
Yes.
The next three questions are kind of just yes or no questions. We can kind of answer this pretty quickly, I think. Yeah, I think the answer to this one, Steve, I'll give you a break. If you have anything, jump in. I think the answer is yes, because taking a temperature is never a requirement. If you want to go on sort of the honor system and request that employees take their own temperatures and self-report or self-police, I think the answer is yes.
Okay. Next question, can employers require the antibody test, not just the virus test?
I think Steve actually covered that part. I think the question came in before Steve hit that part, but no, we don't believe that the antibody test can be required.
All right. Is it okay to offer antibody testing to our staff as long as we do not require it?
We think the answer is yes. If you don't require it, but you offer it as an option and say, hey, we have these tests available if you would like to take the test, we think that that's certainly appropriate and you can do that. The question that I've had that has come up in that context, because I've had this question several times, is, okay, but if we offer it, can we require that they report the results back to us? And again, I think that the answer is no on that.
Okay. And Justin and Aaron, I've had a few people say that they're having trouble hearing you guys. So I think maybe just try to speak louder. I don't think we can do much with some mic issue, but if you can just maybe go closer to the computer and speak louder. Okay, the next question is, Steve, check for 104 degrees Fahrenheit from the EEOC. That's the question. Or what ambulance crews are using 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit for the determination a person has a fever?
I'd have to research that one, because what I would recommend is you go with the CDC standard. The EEOC doesn't have the expertise in the medical side. I know that the CDC has put out a number. I just don't know what off the top of my head what that number is, but that's what you should follow as the CDC's recommendation.
Okay, the next question is, Steve, what about Justin's question? Do we have to accommodate religion for a person who does not want to be tested?
Yes, as long as the person has a legitimate religious belief. And generally, you have to assume that if somebody tells you something is against their religion, you have to assume that to be true unless you know of evidence that's completely contradictory to what they're claiming is their religious belief. So you have to give them the benefit of the doubt. And this comes up every year with flu vaccines. There's employers that want to force somebody to take a flu vaccine, and somebody has a religious objection. And the EEOC has said, you can't force somebody who has a religious objection to take a vaccine, but you can impose other restrictions, like requiring the person to use a mask, requiring the person to work from home until there's and the situation is resolved. Or if none of those are options, you can then say, fine, you don't have to take you don't have to take the test, but you can't return to work and you can't work remote. We don't have remote work available for you, so you're just going to be on unpaid leave of absence until you're ready to return. Or they could use their PTO until that has been exhausted.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, in the town of Paradise Valley, we had an employee that went home due to not feeling well. He tested positive, recovered, and 10 days later, he was asked to come back to work. We asked for another test to make sure he was negative. After 14 days, he took the test, although that needed special approval since the state only allows for one test. The second test came back positive. A week later, the third test came back positive. This makes us feel that without testing, employees that have, quote, recovered may still be carrying the virus.
So this is an interesting scenario because I haven't seen that before, somebody who's had supposedly recovered. But the EEOC has said you can require somebody to take a test as a condition of returning to the workplace. So if you want your policy to be that everybody who's been sent home with COVID-19 symptoms must produce a negative test before they can return, you're permitted to do that under the law. So you can certainly make that a requirement that everybody present a negative test before, and not just rely on the fact that somebody's been asymptomatic for 72 hours and not it's been 10 days. You can require testing.
Okay, the next question is, my library is reopened, but all clients coming in the library are asked how they feel. Have they traveled anywhere, and we take their temperature. The temperature is with the wand. Is this all okay? We have not had problems yet.
I think it's okay.
Okay.
And is it okay? I think it's advisable.
Advisable, great. And the next part of our question is, my senior center should be open again on June 1. That director does not feel it is proper to do any of that. What are your thoughts on that?
Tell the director to start feeling okay about all of that, because I think that it's advisable. I think that helps reduce the potential risk then, because if we don't do it and somebody along the way gets the virus and says, hey, wait a minute, you weren't even asking people, you just letting people come in willy-nilly. I think it's a limited risk, but it's one that's easily avoidable with questions that I think are totally proper.
All right, and then the last part of our question is, also at both departments, they want to have someone sanitize right after anybody leaves. Senior center wants to hire someone just to do coffee, clean tables and chairs, etc. I personally think that is too much, but what would you suggest?
That is one where I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of mine, the question of allocation of municipal resources is going to give you some potential immunity, because it's going to come down to your particular, and I saw who that was, and I can certainly speak with that person later in more detail, since one of my clients. But I think that it's going to come down to resources available. I don't think if you don't do that there's a particular problem, but I do think doing it gives some added protection down the road if somebody claims that enough wasn't done. It just adds to the boxes that we can check and say, look, we did this, we did this, we did this.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a few more questions here, and then we'll go to Gilbert Peoria. When making an accommodation, how do you maintain confidentiality when an employee asks why other employees aren't wearing required PPE?
So you're not allowed to disclose another employee's disability because that's confidential. you can just say, we're aware of the situation. They've been given a waiver of the policy. So they know the employee's not, just deliberately, disregarding it or violating it. That's the only information that you should provide, is we're aware of it and the situation when they've been granted a waiver for appropriate reasons. If you even want to say reasons under the law, so that they know that you're doing something compliant, that's as far as I would go.
Okay, next question is, Mr. Coleman stated that individuals taking temperatures need to be medically trained. How do we handle individuals coming into our library? The staff are not medically trained.
And I think this is overlaps with an earlier question. It's a recommendation that somebody have some minimal medical training. It's not a requirement. So if it's a library facility and obviously you don't have an EMT there and you're not going to pull somebody off the street to go, work full time and take temperatures, you can have somebody else, a library assistant or somebody else do it. The important thing is just that whoever does it understands that they have to use their faithfully adhere to the requirement to use the personal protective equipment, not get lackadaisical and start taking off their mask, that they need to stand an appropriate distance and use a touchless thermometer.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. I assume this is for public meetings. What if only streaming and recording audio?
I can take this one. I don't know that there's any requirement under the open meeting law for you to do it by video or anything like that, or even to record meetings at all. It is an alternative for you to be able to provide greater public access to do the recording. But to my knowledge, I don't think there's any issue with doing a streaming with just audio. I don't know if there has to be a video component to the extent that's the question.
Right, but if the issue is it's just video and there is no audio, I think that's a problem. I think that the idea is that the public has to have the ability to observe the proceedings. Listening and hearing what's going on is enough. Of course, you've got other public access issues, ADA issues with that, but I think that's adequate, yeah.
Okay, we'll do one more question and then we're going to go to Gilbert. Advice on opening rec center pool. I do like your suggestion to have them sign a waiver. Can you send me a template? And I also received an email about your events waiver, Justin, and if you are open to it, I can send it to all those who are in attendance.
Absolutely, yeah. And I see the next question, which you're not going to get to, is will the slides be available? And yeah, if they're available through you guys, great. If not, and if somebody wants our slides, just send any of us an email and we can send you a PDF of it.
Yeah, and then I'll do the next question too. So everybody, we will send the presentations to all those who signed up for this webinar, along with the link to this recording. And somebody in the next question asked, can you please share the lead guidance document that was referenced? We will send that out as well to all those who are attending this webinar. Okay, so we'll take a break from the questions now, and now we're going to go to Leah and Mary from the town of Gilbert to talk about what their process is as they reopen their town.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, well, Mary is going to be, Mary's going to be loading our presentation. We're in the same room, but we are practicing physical distancing. And so while she gets that loaded up, just a quick thank you to the League for putting this together. During a time like this, where we are in uncharted waters, it is very reassuring to know that we're all in this together and that we've got the League to be able to provide such great resources for us. So very grateful for this opportunity this morning. So as we begin to evaluate how to best reopen our facilities during a time when things are changing by the day and in many cases by the hour, there were some impossible questions that seem to keep popping up over and over again, kind of like what you see on the screen, some variations of that. And we felt like trying to identify a perfect path forward could actually just get us stuck before we even started. But we also know that while it isn't possible to make everybody happy, that doesn't eliminate the very real pressure that our leaders face when they're having to answer to thousands of constituents. And so that's a tough place to be. At this point, we've almost likely referenced or heard it referenced how we are in unprecedented times that we're living in. And we're being called on to make untested decisions, which is a very scary thing when you feel the responsibility and the weight of your community's health on your shoulders. At the same time, not everybody feels the same way about COVID-19. So you might have experienced that your community might be polarized on that, and how severe is it and how seriously we should take it. So we recognize that whatever we do is going to be judged from multiple perspectives, but we also realized we didn't have to have all the answers to know what to do as far as what the right thing is. This is one of our favorite quotes that has been helping to guide and inspire our executive leadership team as we've gone through the last 3 months and tried to chart the path forward. So we embrace the fact that we may not get everything right and that we're probably going to need to change, adapt, and course correct along the way. And we embedded that in all of our messaging so that we could manage expectations from the beginning. But again, we made it clear that we don't have to have all the answers in order to do the right thing. So with that in mind, from a 30,000-foot level, we focused on charting the path to reopening around 3 main elements. The first one is emphasizing to our employees, to our teams, to the community, that we are all in this together. And we weren't afraid to acknowledge when things are challenging. Serving in local government is definitely a calling, and now more than ever, this is our time to figure out how we can continue to serve. And regardless of the feedback that is coming our way, we try to respond with a lens of compassion and a desire to help. A lot of people are very stressed, very anxious, very fearful, and we had to try to filter that out as we provided our response to the community and to our employees. The second key element was having a clear why behind our decisions. And really this comes down to data. Not everybody might agree with the data that's out there, but most people are willing to accept decisions that are going to be based on universally recognized entities like OSHA, the CDC, the White House, and the governor's office. And so we made sure that as we made decisions, we communicated the why behind those and the data that was behind those. And that made that more compelling and acceptable, I think, to our community and our employees. We also communicated, over-communicated. You can't communicate enough during times like these, and I'm sure so many of you have already employed this strategy. With so much fear and uncertainty, that can breed a lot of questions, wild thoughts, just people not, understanding what's happening. And so we thought, well, we don't have a lot of certainty, but what we do know and what we are going to do, we're going to communicate over and over and over again so that at least employees and the community know what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, what it's going to look like, why we're doing it, and just be really strong on communication. So since this was a new situation for all of us, our manager created 4 main teams to tackle different parts of recovery and reopening. And what you see highlighted on the screen is Team 2. So Mary Goodman and I had the opportunity to lead Team 2, and we assembled 9 team members, which sounds large, but it was a very nimble team. And we pulled from different parts and levels of the organization to try to make sure we had broad perspectives. We wanted people who were going to challenge the thought process, provide different perspectives, so that whatever recommendations we came up with for reopening town facilities and bringing employees back to work, that it was a balanced approach. So we had 9 members. Thank goodness for Microsoft Teams. That was a main tool for us. And so our team met via Microsoft Teams once or twice a week for a couple hours, but then the rest of that engagement, answering questions and review and all of that stuff occurred online. So we're really thankful for that platform. And of course, it goes without saying that any of our recommendations were vetted by our HR department, our legal department, our communications team, so that we had consistent branded messaging, the town manager's office, and the mayor and council as well, so that everybody knew what was going to happen, when it was going to happen, what it was going to look like, and everybody felt like their perspective was incorporated. So that was at the kind of broad 30,000-foot level. We're going to start diving into the operational level of what does this actually look like. With the phased reopening of town facilities, our town manager implemented weekly town halls, virtual town halls, where once a week he was sharing information with the organization and with the mayor and council, and he was and took questions on that. So this slide is one of the slides we shared early on with our employees as we began to contemplate reopening. We shared that we're going to take a phased approach, so it wasn't going to be everybody's all back on June 1. We shared that we're going to use data to make those decisions so that it wasn't arbitrary and that employees knew that they were going to be treated fairly. We wanted them to know that we take their safety very, very seriously. And we also emphasized, again, something I mentioned early on, flexibility, agility, being able to course correct as time goes on and we learn what's working well and what isn't. We've had a strong push from employees they want to know permanently, like, can I remote work permanently? Can my hybrid work environment be permanent? And we have really emphasized that we're not going to make permanent decisions at this time. We want to stay open and responsive to what's in front of us. And then as we learn and figure out what's going to be working best, we'll be in a better position to make long-term decisions. So with that, we shared the data behind our decisions. And so I think all of you are probably familiar with the data that's been used at the county and state and federal levels, CDC, again, OSHA, White House, Maricopa County Department of Health. And so just trying to provide reassurance to our employees that decisions are going to be based on information like this. And we're really thankful. OSHA put out mitigation controls. This was a new concept for me, so I got to do a deep dive with our safety manager into mitigation controls. And basically, these are to evaluate and try to systematically remove hazards from the workplace. And so our legal team referenced this early in the presentation. We looked at engineering controls, which is basically physical opportunities to eliminate hazards that don't rely on individual behavior. A good example would be sneeze guards. Administrative controls, which are typically changes to your work policy. So you're developing new HR policies related to COVID. Safe work practices, encouraging frequent hand sanitization, safe work practices. And then of course, PPE. So I think everybody's familiar with PPE at this point. We do know that not all hazards are able to be removed, but a combination of these different controls will help to provide the safest environment possible for our employees. So here's just a quick snapshot of what some of these mitigation controls look like. You may have already installed these in your municipal buildings or are in the process of trying to order them. Some of them are on back order, so good luck. But sneeze guards is a good example of an engineering mitigation control, the physical distancing stickers on the floors, et cetera. As far as administrative controls, our team put together a new safety guidance document to just really clearly outline for our employees what's going to be expected of them if they are coming to an on-site work environment. And we are pushing this out to all of our employees, and they'll be required to electronically acknowledge that they read, received, and understood the information, because we want to make sure that this doesn't just sit in an inbox somewhere. We did have a robust conversation on whether or not to implement temperature checks for our non-sworn employees. As was mentioned earlier, our fire and police department do that on a daily basis. But for our non-sworn employees, we went back and forth. We landed on the side of personal responsibility, and that's included in our safety guidance document, and strongly encouraging our employees to do daily temperature checks and to stay home if their temperature is above a certain threshold. A few more examples of safe work practices, mitigation controls. So if you haven't already, we learned quickly we needed to adjust thresholds for conference rooms in any place that could be a gathering spot. So we settled on a 25 to 30% ratio, but no more than 10 in attendance in a conference room. And we have that posted along with how regularly that room's cleaned and the materials that we're using to just try to put our employees' minds at ease. That was a big part of our effort, was making sure that our employees knew we were taking their safety very seriously. With PPE, again, this is definitely a robust topic. We did land on requiring our employees to wear surgical masks if they are working on site in an environment where they cannot maintain physical distancing. We knew that some employees would want this. We knew other employees would not. We felt it was better to apply a uniform protocol for everyone. If someone's working at their desk, they don't have to wear it. But if they're going to be going down the hallway to the break room or the copy machine, we are asking them to wear that surgical mask. And then finally, what implementing these controls looks like for every department is going to be a little bit different. And so we've asked all of our departments to develop the controls and the plan that's going to work best for them. For example, our Parks and Rec teams are very front facing, and so we definitely are having sneeze guards installed at front counters and things like that. That may not be necessary for a team that is working in an office environment that doesn't see any customers on a daily basis. So we've asked our teams to apply this on a departmental level. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Goodman for the second part of our presentation.
Hello, everybody. As Matt mentioned at the beginning, one of the teams that I have the great fortune of working with is the information technology team. And for whatever reason, that means today that I get gremlins and technological challenges. So if you can't hear me, please say so in the chat questions. But as Leah mentioned, we're going to talk about what this specifically looked like for Gilbert. All right, so we had a lot of conversation about establishing the phases and determining the employee work groups and who would come back at what time. So first we started with asking our directors to self-identify and rank by priority teams who would be returning to facilities, and not asking the question of when, but asking who would come first. And what we asked them to do was evaluate based on prior volume. I'm getting some signs that I need to be louder. We asked them to evaluate based on prior volume of interaction with the public, any impacts to customer service delivery. So some of those would be recreation facilities, and obviously those that have had impacts when the facilities were closed. And then we also took input from our employees through a remote work survey. What we found in that is that 72% of our employees indicated that they'd like to see a hybrid moving forward. And more than 66%, I want to say, indicated that they'd seen increased productivity in a remote environment. And so we wanted to incorporate what's worked well and get that feedback from them to establish the work groups. So from that director survey, we established work groups A through G. And it's important to note that with any of this, it's intended to be a framework, and what we did is establish the upper capacities for each of these groups, but they are not set in stone. As Leah mentioned, they're intended to be flexible and guidelines as we work through this process. So here's where the data fell out. The public safety and field staff that were already on site during the pandemic when other buildings were closed were our public safety and field staff. That equated to about 800 individuals. The numbers you see on the screen, we counted people, not FTE, because obviously in spaces like Parks and Recreation and others, you might have multiple employees who are part-time, and 3 people could occupy 1 FTE. So we asked our directors to think about the number of people who would be entering those facilities. So next group was recreation and aquatic staff, about 200. Group A, that first priority group back, is about 180 people, group B 150, and group C through G about another 250. And you'll see how those shook out in each of the phases. What we did is, in looking at that data, it naturally translated to a series of phases and upper limits or capacities. So for phase 1, that was starting on May 15th. It included the staff that had already been on site, as well as our recreation and aquatic center staff. Phase 2 is starting on Monday, so Leah and I have nothing to do between now and then. Just a lot of logistics to continue to work through, as I'm sure all of you do as well. But that will be our phase 1 folks that are already on site, plus up to 25% of our remote workforce having the ability to return on site. And why I'm emphasizing those particular words is we've had a lot of questions within our own team of, is that a minimum? Is that a mandate? And the answer is no. We are asking, and what we did is we built these as capacities so that up to 25% of our remote workforce could return on site. And we compared that to the staff that were already on site in the various facilities to make sure that we weren't going to run into circumstances where we had field staff that were already there and remote staff that would cause too many individuals on site at one time based on where we're at in our response to the pandemic. So that first phase is going to be about up to 25%. It's going to look different for every team. There will be a hybrid of remote and on-site employees, and we're asking directors to use their discretion in determining schedules, who's on site what day, and building in a lot of flexibility, again, that this is not set in stone. These are guidelines, and it's going to help us as we return to on-site facilities. Phase 3, we've not established a date, and we're doing that for a reason, in that we are evaluating, as Leah said, the data that she showed on that slide, current guidance, and so on. But that phase will allow for prior phases and then up to 40% of the remote workforce with groups A and B. Future phases, we've not identified, is it going to be 4, is it going to be 5, is it going to be 6? Because we know that the situation has changed many times since the COVID outbreak first began, and our response needs to adapt with that. But what we know is that those future phases will accommodate up to 100% of that remote workforce returning on site or having the capacity to do so. We're also going to be looking, as Leah mentioned, for those longer term solutions, but at this time be making the decisions that for the questions that are in front of us right now and planning for what we can with the information that we have. At each stage, we're going to be evaluating various triggers, the data that Leah indicated, and looking at different metrics to see where we're at and if we're in a good spot to progress to that next phase. So what are some of those questions? What are the trends in regional hospitalizations? What is the current guidance from governor's office, from CDC, and so on? Is the current environment working? Are we seeing anything where we're experiencing customer impacts? Are we seeing anything where it's just not working well for the individual teams? Folks are running into challenges. They don't have the equipment they need. Team 3 is working on actually addressing that very thing, making sure that we've got the right equipment for our folks who are going to stay in a remote environment longer. Also looking at our PPE requirements and making sure that at every turn we can satisfy the capacities and requirements that we've set, and our physical distancing and other guidelines being upheld. There's consistent language throughout our documents. In some areas, things are required. In other areas, it's strongly encouraged. And we want to make sure that people are listening and upholding those guidelines before we move forward. So for example, phase 1, this is what it looked like for Gilbert. And obviously it's going to look different in all of your communities. And I'm sure that you're working through these very things as we speak. But for us, what it meant in that first phase was focusing on those facilities that had the largest impact to the public when they were closed. So that being our recreation centers, our special programs, our aquatics. So I won't read these individual facilities, but as I mentioned, starting on May 15th, we started opening back up our recreation centers for on-site visitors. The team also put together some really cool concepts with drive-in movies that have been a big hit, and other things that can still encourage strict physical distancing, but reintroduce that programming and special events within the community. So as I mentioned, phase 1 is live. That's been underway for the last couple of weeks. We are getting ready for phase 2 on Monday, which will include that up to 25% of remote staff. As I mentioned, at all stages, we're anticipating a hybrid environment blending on-site and remote work. And the phases are going to serve as a framework that will be evaluated as the situation evolves. So in these first couple slides on phase 2, I'm going to focus on what's happening in our buildings. So the buildings that, in addition to the staff that are coming back, there are some additional buildings that are going to be opening to the public. So those include all of the buildings that were open in prior phases, as well as our municipal campus. So our Muni 1 building, our Muni 2 building, our household hazardous waste facility with some additional protocols and procedures in place there, and our fire administration building. On this slide, you'll see some examples of the graphics that Leah used as an example actually put in place in the facilities. So those markers on the floor to help in public areas indicate what would be those markers for 6 feet of physical distancing, the sneeze guards that have been installed at our Freestone Recreation Facility, and as in the third picture, as we're affectionately calling it, our classy bungee cords to space our seating within the council chambers, which leads me to the next item. We are going to be having our first expanding from online to in-person reintroduction of the public on site for our council meetings on Tuesday, June 2nd. So phase 1 starts on Monday, council meeting Tuesday, planning commission is the following day on Wednesday. So we have a couple opportunities to work our way through this first go round. But what the team focused on for the expanding from our online options to in-person was first staying compliant with open meeting law. We've done that from the very beginning, but we again wanted to keep that as a focus as we looked at this next transition. We are going to be continuing and encouraging our online participation through WebEx. We are going to be adding physical distancing and protocols, as well as reduced capacity. So where we landed, our council chambers has about 180 seats within the audience. We set the audience capacity at 60, so at about a third. We are also increasing opportunities for public comment. So through a variety of options that are emailing in advance, kind of relooking at our comment cards through WebEx. So there's a variety of different options where people can participate and offer public comment. We've also kept a focus on continued safety of our visitors, council and employees. So specifically targeting our lobby area, ingress, egress, general flow of the public, those stickers and spacing. Our council chambers, as I mentioned, with those classy bungee cords and spacing out the seats. Masks and PPE that will be available to our employees and the public when requested. Hand sanitizer stations, protocols for public restrooms. So we are going to be requesting that one person at a time utilize the restroom, with the exception of those with small children or those that need assistance. It is a suggestion and request. It is not a requirement. And then we've also built in a strict cleaning regimen and sanitization protocols. So on the right, you'll see some examples. We have some stanchions that will be in place to help direct the flow of traffic, as well as signage that people will see when they enter our building that indicates what we're going to be asking them for in terms of helping us to follow physical distancing, that masks are available upon request, and that the capacity is limited to 60 individuals in the chambers. So on the employee side, I mentioned what's happening for the actual buildings, but on the employee side, we've been working around the clock pretty much to establish different training protocols for employees and helping them understand what to expect and what they need to do. So Leah mentioned the safety guidelines that have all of our documentation. It's kind of a one-stop shop, but there are also signs that are posted throughout the building and a graphic like this that are available to them that offer information on not to come to work if they're experiencing any of these symptoms. We are asking people to take their temperatures prior to coming into work. We are strongly encouraging them to do so and doing some self-monitoring there, not only with their temperatures, but other symptoms. At every turn, we're asking folks, if it's COVID or anything else, if you're sick, please don't come to work. Use those remote work tools or take a sick day, whichever works best for you. One of the biggest questions we get is, when do I need to wear a mask? So the team put together this decision tree, and it really comes down to, can I maintain a physical distance of 6 feet, yes or no? If you can, you do not need to wear a mask. If you can't, you do need to wear a mask, and we will be requiring this of our employees. So at the bottom, you'll see we put together some examples of where that might occur, when they'll need to be wearing a mask. In lobbies and service counters, even with the sneeze guards, because they will be, there is, for example, in our planning windows, as people are passing plans under the window, there is an opportunity for those folks to interact, and they're closer than 6 feet. Hallways and corridors, by our vending machines, our break rooms are closed, but our vending machines are located within them. So we've left those open, but are asking people not to congregate. Copy rooms, print rooms, and so on. We also get a common question about, can I bring my own mask? Everyone has these great fabrics and things that they want to sport on their own. And what we've asked is that people save those for their weekend use, because we are going to be providing surgical grade masks to our employees and requiring that they wear those. It offers potentially an extra layer of protection, and we want to make sure that it's consistent throughout our workforce in what PPE we're providing and requiring of them. So speaking of PPE, a lot of employees have asked, where will I get it? And some of these questions are coming out of those town halls that Leah mentioned, where we have a live environment for people to ask Q&A, for us to do Q&A. So early on, our EOC was activated, and the team has done a phenomenal job acquiring PPE for our response in this pandemic. Through that, we were able to put a team together and establish these kits that you see on the screen that are being dropped off at various facilities as we speak, that include common things like hand sanitizer, cleaning solutions, masks, gloves if they're needed. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a document that is included with those kits that offer recommended daily PPE usage. You'll see on there there's a chart in the middle that indicates the recommended usage by employee type. So what we did is recognize that obviously a police officer, a park ranger, other folks that are in the field have a greater chance of interacting with the public and a greater frequency of interacting with the public. So that's going to require different kinds of PPE and different volumes of PPE than you will if, let's say, you're in a cube and or in an office. So that guidance is to help employees see that. And then at the bottom, for their working knowledge and to help them understand where we're at, we've also included months of current supply. And we're going to be updating that. And as Leah mentioned, at every stage, we've tried to be incredibly transparent with our employees, with the council, with the public, to let them know our response, our planning efforts, and how prepared we are to take this on, and how that all is factoring in which phase we're in the reopening of facilities. So what's been key to success? As Leah mentioned, technology. That's been a key driver in our success. Our team implemented Office 365 last year and did it in a very compressed timeline. I want to say it was about 5 weeks to bring our entire organization online. Did a phenomenal job with that. And had that not been in place, I can tell you that the remote work environment would have probably gone very differently. It's been key in all of this so that we can have those morning huddles, team meetings, share documents, collaborate. Prior to this, they also just happened to have established our ITSM software, ticketing software, that we used for rolling out within 24 hours remote work agreements for nearly 800 employees. So again, can't emphasize that enough, that it's just been a great resource for us. As Leah mentioned, the cross-departmental teams, those 4 different teams, and then all the work that's gone on between them, we really have a great cross-section across the organization, all different levels, different strengths, different experiences that have been instrumental in our approach. As Leah mentioned, we've had review by our key stakeholders, those being attorney's office, HR, manager's office, digital, and so on. We've communicated early, often, over and over again on our website, social media, and through those town hall offerings, as well as email and so on. And building in that flexibility, and again, keeping an eye on creativity. That Team 3 effort is really focused on innovation and how we can have the things that have come out of this that have been really creative in our problem solving and innovative really take root within our organization and continue into the future. So for example, early on in the response, I know you all know that there was a shortage of hand sanitizer and cleaning solution. Everyone was, stocking up on those items, and then they became in short supply. So in a morning huddle, our public works director mentioned, hey, we can make bleach at our water treatment plants through a series of chemicals and a heat and a system that I could not even possibly try to explain to you right now. But what I know is that it created, through that, diluting it, offered a cleaning solution that is available to our teams in the event that we run low on some of the other items, which again, the spirit of this is just to capture that creativity and problem solving. So looking to the future, we're keeping the safety of the community and our staff top of mind with each phase. We continue to look for ways to meet our residents and businesses where they are. They're online, they want their services online. And so this has really provided a unique opportunity for us to deliver those services in a remote environment and really not have an interruption in our service delivery for our residents. The phased approach, again, is intended to serve as a framework, and it will be updated as the situation evolves. And we know that the future work environment will include some form of hybrid of on-site and remote work appropriate situations. As Leah mentioned, we're not going to set in stone what those are right now, but we are keeping an eye on what that could look like for us now and in the future. And we've encouraged them to stay tuned for information about future phases. So with that, that's our last slide. That website has our department-specific information, a similar presentation to the one you just saw, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, Mary and Leah. We're going to go to Jay Davies now with Peoria, and then we will open it up to questions from everybody after Jay is complete speaking. So thank you from Gilbert, and Jay, we'll go to you now.
All right, thanks, Matt, and good morning, everybody. I, of course, want to mirror Leah's sentiments about the leadership and guidance that the league is providing throughout all of this. I really appreciate that and the opportunity to speak to everybody. I am going to share my screen now. You always want everything to work right. Okay. So I want to start with our approach to this. So throughout February, our city manager was, like all of us, seeing increasing media reports, watching other cities around the country responding, some better than others. And at this point, of course, Arizona just had one case. Whether it was perceived or real, there was a growing sense of uncertainty and panic. And we knew as a city that we would be expected to respond effectively to this crisis. Having been through the avian flu and an EOC exercise years before, our city manager recognized that a lot of thought went into that, but that a lot of the people that were involved in that exercise, they weren't around the organization anymore. So in that last weekend in February, he came back on May 2nd on that Monday, which happened to be the day the second Arizona case was confirmed. And he put the wheels in motions for us to form our first working group. And that group got up to speed very fast, formed a cross-functional multidisciplinary team that actually met the next day on May 3rd for the first time. We wanted to be proactive, and that's what all of that was about, that thinking, kind of getting ahead of the curve. We believe as much as you can be ahead of the curve in something like this. We wanted to be objective. Early on, it was evident that there were multiple perspectives on the scope and severity of COVID, as well as the best way to respond. So we chose to tether our actions to science, a theme you've already heard this morning, particularly the CDC and then later Arizona Department of Health Services. If you haven't been on the CDC site, I urge you to take a look. They offer guidance on everything now. If you were on there 2 weeks ago, there's now hundreds of new things on there. They're really keeping abreast of what's going on now. Lots of guidance on very specific issues. And then we wanted to be comprehensive. Our first group was kind of the overall think tank, and I'll talk about those groups in a moment, it was intentionally multidisciplinary. But then we also formed other specialty working groups that were formed to address more specific aspects. In terms of being comprehensive, though, we really saw at the beginning, we had two audiences or two constituencies. We had our internal workforce, which we would have kind of one set of needs and perspectives, and then of course our community and their needs and perspectives. So throughout all of this, we kept those two audiences in mind as we worked through our responses. So with our working groups, the first one we formed was our COVID Action Response Team. You'll hear me refer to it as ART for short, the Action Response Team. This really was the key to getting that cross the organization perspective. It included folks from facilities, public works, human resources, members of our legal team were right there every time we met, our Office of Communications, the fire department. I hope you're as fortunate as me. We have a great problem solver in our fire department, and he continues to be a go-to on all things CDC and medical related. We had folks from emergency management, human services, parks and rec, our water department, and materials management. Believe it or not, on the first meeting, we didn't think to include them, but we quickly realized with our supply chain concerns, we needed somebody there for materials management. So that was the first team. And our first couple of meetings, we met in person. Again, it was early March, but then all of a sudden the light went off and our meeting started to look like this. I'm sure those look familiar to you. We then added some additional teams. We have a business support team. This is a group that consists of our deputy city manager, economic development, even some business groups that we were already working with, and they're looking at how to assist and support local businesses. Among others, they have three key priorities. They are providing tools to pivot. You know, we provided signs to restaurants to indicate delivery and curbside options, make sure the public knew as they drove by what was available. Assisting with and applying for financial assistance, whether it's through PPP or other sources. And then the third was to use our own city platforms where appropriate and where feasible to kind of promote these efforts and therefore promote the viability of our local businesses. The next group that we put together was supplemental services. This is largely based out of our Neighborhood and Human Services Department, and where they had to pivot really from their typical social service delivery to alternate methods to make sure that those key services that our residents relied on were still available wherever possible through alternate methods, whether that's home delivery for otherwise congregate meals. You know, our developmentally disabled programs had to cease operation in a facility, so they pivoted to home visits and taking the participants one at a time on walks. And there's been some great stuff coming out of that group. They're also working closely with our school district to make sure that our summer school programs, our youth programming is still viable and ready to be operable when that time comes. Next group we put together was our public outreach team. That's a nice euphemism. These are the folks that got to deal with the enforcement and education as we saw our own mayor and the governor imposing restrictions with the various declarations. This group was formed to address how we would approach education and enforcement, handle complaints, things of that nature. This include supervisors and managers that involved our park rangers, code enforcement, police department, and of course, members of our legal team to keep everything on the rails. The most recent group we formed is actually the mayor's task force, and it's a little bit of a different spin on our business support group. It involves a lot of members of the business community, but they're actually at the table with the mayor and the mayor's staff to kind of work through the reopening and kind of problem solve that, make sure that we have their voices heard in that process as we move forward. So those are really the groups that we put together. COVID, the action response team is kind of the overall central think tank. You know, I know we've got some cities of all different sizes on here, and you've probably already experienced this, and that is, you know, you don't want your city or your town manager to get every question that bubbles up. Should I wear a mask? Can I do this? How do I handle this? So this team kind of became the funnel through which all of that came, and it was staffed in a way that, again, with legal and HR directors and high-level members of the organization, we were able to vet a lot of those decisions and where appropriate, make recommendations to the city manager, but in many cases, just make those decisions on our own. Next, I want to talk just real briefly about declarations and talk about a couple of things that we learned. And I'm speaking just of our own city declarations. But quickly, we recognized that we needed to put some things in place to provide authority to take certain measures. So when our mayor declared an emergency, we saw that as providing two things for us. One is we believed that would trigger our eligibility for federal funding. And then secondly, it would give us greater flexibility. With our ordinances and charter, there were certain things that we wanted to be able to tweak or dial down. And the best example I can give you is with all the hardships our local businesses were facing, we wanted to relax our sign code. We wanted to allow them to be more aggressive in signage and advertising in ways that normally, you know, wouldn't be allowed under our sign code. But that's one of the things that we were able to relax under this emergency declarations. I will, you know, kind of the advisory and the message here is look closely at your charter, look at your emergency operations plans, look at your policies. We found a couple places where, you know, we thought we could do A, but we really need to do B, C, and D before we could start to take certain actions. So check all of those documents to make sure you're connecting all the dots and you know who can do what with or without others and with or without other votes, if you know what I'm saying. So that's enough about declarations, but that's kind of where we're at. We still have a declaration in place of emergency. It allows us to continue to flex those ordinances where necessary. It also allows us to continue the ability to open and close facilities that would otherwise be open. So some policy considerations we got into early on. A number of policy items, as I'm sure you're all dealing with, they've been works in progress really from early March. We now, just in this last week, have kind of let the ink dry on that. It's been through the vetting and we kind of now know where we want to land on all of those. We have a fairly comprehensive COVID policy. It's really A to Z on COVID. It outlines our tactics for recognition, prevention, and exposure avoidance. Some of the key policies that have emerged so far include leave. Early on, probably before it was mandated, but we were certainly anticipating that was coming. We created an 80-hour leave bank for employees to use for COVID-specific activities, whether they were sent home as non-essential, if they were sick or quarantined, caring for another who was. things of that nature. Everyone in the organization got the 80 hours, and to keep it fair and available to all, it will remain on the books until the end of this calendar year, and we're more than likely going to convert it to sick time. So if you didn't use it, there's kind of an equity. It's still yours and it's still there. Certainly if the fall comes back and we need additional leave time, those who haven't already used it will have it available. The next was exposure control. This was clearly in HR's wheelhouse, and it included ensuring confidentiality of health-related information, the contact tracing that's been mentioned, FMLA designations, alternative work assignments, return to work procedures. If you haven't had a workplace exposure yet, having a policy in place to address and protect the confidentiality, among other things, it's an absolute must. We had our first exposure about the third week in March, and we had these things already in place, so we were able to quickly address the barrage of questions, the high level of anxiety that came out. Everybody, of course, wanted to know who has it, who were they around, where did they go? I want the name. I need to know for myself, did I have contact with this person? And I think it was Aaron who mentioned, or Steve, that you have to protect the confidentiality of that positive case. So we did a number of things to make sure that was the case, but anticipating that anxiety and that people really are going to have a need to know, having that policy in place to kind of explain, here's what we can do and here's how we're going to do it. It really was a lifesaver in that instance. It also provides a level of reassurance for when this unfortunate milestone hits your workforce. Our policy has now grown to include considerations for PPE, for temperature checks, for multiple employees using one city vehicle, a variety of other things, but it really is soup to nuts, an entire COVID policy. One offshoot of the exposure control approach was super cleaning. And I've really come to regret that term, because super cleaning is not super. And what I'm talking about is a large kind of deep sanitization of an area that's had an exposure. When we had our first exposure around March 19th, boy, did we do a super cleaning. Partly we wanted to kind of camouflage patient zero, if you will. So we cleaned buildings that were across the campus and all over the campus from where it was. We felt it was probably a good baseline to get everything good and sanitized anyway. It was very expensive because we hit everything. But as we've come to learn, the CDC now has guidance on how to do these deep cleanings, which is much more surgical and focused than our first clumsy attempt was. But the reason I balk at the term super cleaning and we try to manage expectations is it's not the end all be all. It's only as good as, the minute you're done cleaning, the next person that comes along and has the virus and sneezes in an area or however they transmit it, that super cleaning is kind of moot. So we all throughout this have focused the layered approach. Gilbert mentioned it, and that's the constant education and communication, and whether it's posters or websites about wash your hands, use your PPE, don't come to work if you're sick, all of those things that we now know, we're constantly drilling that in. And the super cleaning is just one of many layers of protection that we provide. Another policy we had to address, and I won't get into great detail because it's been touched, but that's, public meetings. What we did was on the front side, as we were kind of de-escalating our meetings, was we had a hybrid. Some electeds were there on Microsoft Teams platforms or telephonic, depending on the meeting. If we had to do something visual, it was usually through Teams. What we did was provide an overflow room in an adjacent building. If too many members of the public showed up for a meeting, we had an overflow meeting where we could ensure social distancing and still allow them to monitor the meeting from a TV screen. And then if they wanted to speak, we had runners that could bring the speaker form over to the main chambers. We could still bring them over. So we had something in place for that. The guidance from the Attorney General was certainly helpful in navigating what is and is not required for public participation. But all throughout this, we've really had multiple forms of participation available, mostly alternative, but we're now getting back into opening up our meetings, having the full council present. So we'll revert to that overflow room as well. So some other considerations. We wrestled, like everybody, with PPE protocol. We recognized early on that the N95 was kind of the end-all be-all mask, and everybody was going to want one, and they're hard to get. So as you probably know, keeping your first responders stocked up on masks with the highest level of protection, these N95s, it's been difficult. We've been able to get them, but it's not been a walk in the park. And therefore, we treated those like gold and guarded that stockpile accordingly. If you're familiar with the N95, you know their effectiveness comes from heavy filters, and as a result, they're tough to breathe in. We always joke, you think you want an N95, but you really don't want an N95. Where their use is required, OSHA has a protocol that requires the employer to do certain things, including an actual physical, fit testing, training, among other things. So that's really to ensure proper use and the health of the wearer. If employees choose to wear them voluntarily, even if you provide them and they choose to wear them voluntarily, some of those OSHA regulations are relaxed somewhat. You certainly want to look into those as you're making the choice. We've had a few small groups across our workforce that were not in public safety request N95s, and we've reviewed them on a case-by-case basis, knowing that, again, the N95 is not for everybody. They're hard to get. We set up quickly in our art team kind of this process where we would review the request, and we would look for a scientific rationale. And just real quickly, the water department, cleaning sewers and some of the mists that are created and what can be carried in those mists. There were some journal articles and things, even though the CDC was silent on it, the journal articles were helpful, and we decided to grant them in that case. And then the second case that came up more recently was dial-a-ride drivers, not across transit in general, but the dial-a-ride who almost exclusively are picking up vulnerable populations, taking them to or from doctors' offices. We've actually had a couple exposures, not in our passengers, but at the facilities that we're taking them to. So we determined that that was also a good application of the N95 masks. So again, those two cases are voluntary. So much of that OSHA requirement is worked around, but again, look at OSHA if you're gonna use those. The fire department rep on our art team really serves as our primary gatekeeper for our N95 and surgical masks. And when it came time to bring back employees, ultimately our recommendation was to furnish surgical masks, just like Gilbert is doing. Those protect the employee, the wearer, and that's who we're really most concerned about in our workforce is the employee. If we're not requiring masks of the public, which we're not, we need to do something to protect our employees, and the surgical mask that protects the wearer is what we went with. We make them voluntary, except in areas where a manager determines that social distancing is not feasible, a very similar philosophy to what you've heard, in which case our policy then would mandate the use of the mask. We looked at that real hard before we made the commitment to purchase and provide those. We wanted to make sure that the supply chain was adequate and that we weren't kind of creating an expectation that we'll provide these and then they dry up a week later. So we got to a point, fortunately, the planets aligned somewhat. Our supply chain leveled off right about the time we were bringing folks back. We also maintain a stash of cloth masks should we need them. They're kind of they're the plan C for general employees, and then they're the plan B. If our first responders run out of N95s, the surgical mask is the go-to plan B for them, in which case we would probably pivot to cloth masks for general employees. Training for proper use was part of this rollout, which is why having our attorneys as part of these working groups is so important. We tried to stay with known vendors also. There's a lot of scams out there, a lot of too good to be true kind of stuff going on. So we try to stick with ordering our PPE from vendors we already have relationships with, and that's kept us out of trouble. A couple weeks ago, I'll just mention we adjusted our approach to PPE and sanitizing supplies from it's nearly impossible to get, so grab what you can and pay whatever you have to our new approach. With a little patience, you can find it, so don't pay a king's ransom for it. That's where we're at kind of now. Still though, we're monitoring quantities and availability regularly. We're certainly trying to stock way up. We're certainly purchasing more than we needed to maybe back in January, but we're trying to be more cost conscious and a little less panicky about it. The other consideration, and it's been brought up, and that's communication. Again, we have those two audiences, the community and our employee groups. Externally, we stood up a public-facing website. Our primary purpose there, we felt, was to reassure the community that we're managing through the situation, and we will continue to deliver essential services, that their services will not be interrupted. Secondly, we wanted to make clear that we were not the COVID-19 experts. We're not the go-to for that. So our external website provides the typical links to the CDC, Department of Health, and we steer folks there for those sorts of questions. We also have set up a hotline for the public with real live humans that answer the phone and provide direction and referrals on everything COVID, including information on our own operations, what's available, what's not. And then, of course, we get a lot of questions that aren't in our wheelhouse, and the folks handling those calls are trained to refer them to the proper source there. So we had external and then internal. We created a web page really within the first week. It was evident we needed to start communicating, and Leah and Mary, hit the nail on the head. Internal communication has been vital. It's been relied upon heavily. We created a web page specifically on our intranet, our employee intranet, that's like a one-stop shop for COVID matters. Our internet traffic, intranet traffic with employees has never reached these levels before. This thing gets used and abused on a regular basis. Something else we've done internally is to offset the sense of disconnectedness that we've all come to know through these types of meetings, and to lend a more reassuring and personal touch. Our city manager has been doing weekly kind of fireside chat type videos for our employees, keeping them updated on how we're managing the situation, reassuring them, and reinforcing the important role they have in our commitment to delivering service. As questions have arisen, we've addressed those questions in those emails. These have been very well received, and I think they come at a time where this personal connection and this level of reassurance has really resonated with our workforce. And I can offer no better proof than the fact that many members of our police department have been praising them profusely. So if you supervise a police department in your work, I think you can appreciate the validity that has. Part of our art team agendas include a scan of what we're hearing and observing from both the public and our workforce. And that information helps guide our communication strategy and content as we hear, whether it's rumors or questions or concerns in the public or in our workforce. We can quickly pivot and make sure that we're addressing those either on the website or in these weekly videos or both. So that's been very effective. That multifunctional team, that's one of the benefits, obviously, is they're across the organization. They hear from a diverse group of employees, and they bring that back to this. And then there's cost tracking. Whether you're seeking grant funds, reimbursement, or you just want to know the impact the virus is having on your budget, tracking COVID-related costs is, of course, paramount. We created a cost code within our finance system to identify those hard costs on those commodities. And then we identified the various meetings, activities, and operations that are uniquely COVID related. Of course, we'll know more this week about how much that granular level detail is necessary for state funding, but it seems pretty obvious that for federal dollars, you're going to need that level of detail. So if you haven't done that already, I would encourage you to start keeping track of that. It's hard to go back. So from here, I kind of want to transition to our plan, our reopening plan. We based ours on, you've heard this already, the White House plan, the Opening Up America plan. That ended up being very fortuitous because, as you know, a couple weeks later, Arizona adopted the same model and has begun to talk about its reopening efforts under that same framework. So we were fortunate to adopt that early on and base our plan around that. Despite the politics of COVID and the various approaches to it, we found that the Opening Up America framework provided a sound, scientific, and gradual phased-in approach that seemed to make a lot of sense to us. So this is just one sample, and you can't necessarily read all of those things. That's not the intent, but the way it's laid out, and this is our public-facing. The plan itself is really a Word document. It's very long and unwieldy because it has a lot of detail in it. Our Office of Communications created this public-facing version of it with the lovely logos and all the great visuals. But what you'll see is that the Open Up America plan made for a handy template. It was fairly simple for our department heads to plug and play their own operational transitions into it. what you'll see here is the federal guideline is the blue, light blue shaded, and that comes right from Opening America. Again, there's a federal guideline, and then the tenets, the philosophies, the standards within that guideline, they help drive what we do under it. And it became a very, very obvious template. Open Up America says that this is the standard. Here are the things that match that standard. And it really helped us build our own phased approach to this. We have two different versions. One's internal, which focuses more on the workplace changes. This one is the external plan, which focuses more on community programming, facilities, things of that nature that the public cares about. The plan really describes the actions only, but in our own internal documents and deliberations, our decisions are based on factors that include the federal gating criteria that Justin mentioned, state guidance, and of course our local needs. Has 3 phases, has that point-by-point federal guidance and city actions, our 2 audiences. We haven't put dates on our phases because, and I think Mary mentioned it as well, or Leah may have, we're kind of playing this by ear. We're monitoring the data. We're monitoring our own internal conditions. With the phased-in approach of bringing employees back in phases, that gives you the luxury of testing the impact. You know, what happened to our own internal cases? Are we seeing outbreaks? How are people responding from an anxiety level? So by not putting dates on the future phases, we feel we can monitor that and be flexible. And then, of course, we're following both federal, state, and local guidance there. Are happy to provide our plan. You can see it on our public webpage. That's the address there. In addition to the plan itself, or actually part of the plan, there's a couple other things that we had to address, and Gilbert did something similar with the conference room capacity. I kind of want to take a little bit of a different flavor on that. We did the same thing. We reduced our capacities and posted them on the conference rooms. But what we noticed is council chambers, and you're probably similar, fairly sizable room, groups of 10 or under. By the time you fill the dais with electeds and city leaders, you're already at 10. So we were at a point there where we said, why don't we treat it like a restaurant? Restaurants aren't limiting attendance to 10, they're limiting groups or clumps to 10. So we can spread people out in a way that allows more than 10 people into the building, but we monitor and distribute them in a manner that, you know, small parties in a restaurant, you know those folks, you're with them, it's your family, but you're not any closer than 6 feet or more from the next group that's in there. So with some of our larger conference rooms, including our council chambers, we've kind of adopted that restaurant philosophy where it's not limited to 10, but you are still building in that social distancing. Wellness windows, I've heard them referred to as sneeze shields, but that makes me never want to eat at a Sizzler again. So I actually stole the term from Delaware, Ohio. They use the term wellness windows. Still the same plexiglass structure you're seeing everywhere, and those floor decals. We were fortunate enough to get those installed on the same day that we opened to the public. So that was a good move for our employees in terms of their comfort level. And then very similar to Gilbert, we're using voluntary measures for employees with respect to masks and temperature checks. Gilbert mentioned their kits, which sound amazing, the toolboxes that they have around. We have something similar, a little less portable. Most of our areas, work areas, have wellness stations where we have gloves, masks, hand sanitizer, probably many of the same things that are in the Gilbert kit, but out available for work groups to access in their area. So we are not placing any requirements on the public. The only thing that's mandatory for employees is in those situations where a manager determines that social distancing isn't feasible, then a mask might be required. So just some final thoughts. At this point, our work groups are continuing to meet. The art team in particular, our role continues to be to look at the current trends, the data, what's happening in the organization. At each meeting, we take a trigger. Yesterday, we dissected, there's a particular building on our campus. If we suddenly had an outbreak within a couple days of 3 or 4 cases, you know, what would that trigger? How would we respond to that? We want these plans in place and these steps in place so when it happens, we're not then scratching our head trying to figure out what to do. So we look at things like, is it a citywide pause in our phase one, or do we revert to prior to phase one? Do we do something locally in that department? Do we do it building wide? Do we do it citywide? So all of those types of considerations come into play. Of course, we're monitoring and planning for those triggers. And then largely we're shifting our focus to fiscal matter considerations. Like many of you are trying to figure out what impacts is this going to have on our budget. So we're making those adjustments. We're working hard on those reimbursements and of course, federal grants as well. So that's kind of where Peoria is at with this right now. I figured a lot of this would overlap. You know, we had a chance to visit with Gilbert about their plan, and I know we're very similar in our approaches, which is odd. We're at opposite corners of the valley. I assure you we did not look over one another's shoulder, but kind of watered this down a little bit to avoid some of that redundancy. So with that, happy to address any questions.
Okay, thank you, Jay. And we do have a number of questions here, so we will now open it up for these questions to the full group. The first question is, for open meeting, what if you only allow comment through email during the meeting or before the meeting on a public hearing? I think that would be for you, Justin, and your group.
Yep. So for open meeting, again, I think part of the issue is deciding whether this is for public hearing or for just a general comment response to the public. It looks like this question is directed towards public hearing. I've seen differing approaches. There's not a lot of guidance in the law about this. The better approach is certainly to allow some form of input or some sort of real-time comment during public hearing. That's what we've been more comfortable with, and that's kind of the recommended approach.
If there's a way to do that via electronic meetings, I think it works, but I mean, I think it meets the requirements of the law. Logistically, I'm not sure that that's a very easy thing. Although, I mean, we're doing it right here. I mean, we're getting a Q&A, and I think that if there was a real-time way to make sure that those comments were presented, then I think it meets the requirements of the law that public comment be considered.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, many employees have spouses that are doctors or nurses, regularly working on the front lines with COVID-19 patients. What should be done with these employees? Permanent telecommute? What if that isn't possible?
I can take this one. I think the answer is if there's an option to teleccommute, like how we've kind of been saying during this presentation, then great, continue to permit the telecommuting and minimize those interactions to the extent possible. If it's not something that's feasible, this employee is in a position where telecommuting simply isn't an option or isn't a long-term realistic option. The best we're going to be able to do is implement those safety measures and social distancing measures as best we can, and try to allow use of PPE and assuage those concerns as best we can. But that, when push comes to shove, some folks are going to have to, by nature of the job, return to work, just to respect those distancing measures as best we can and be understanding and accommodating as best we can.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, air handlers have been shown to spread COVID-19 as well as other air circulation in buildings. What is the liability to a town?
I think liability is very low, no different than any other public place. I don't think there's a significant liability there. If that's the case, there are other concerns perhaps, but in terms of being sued for that and liability, I think it's very low.
Okay. Thank you.
Matt, if I could, and it's not from the liability standpoint, but one of the benefits of having Public Works on our team is they changed the settings on our air handlers to greatly increase the amount of fresh air that was coming in. Again, doesn't speak to the liability piece, but it was a measure that we took and continue to take to bring more fresh air into the buildings.
Excellent, thank you. Next question, if the summer camp an employee usually sends their child to is closed or canceled, but there are alternative camp options available, can they still use the expanded FMLA leave?
I can take this one. The answer is yes, they can still use the expanded FMLA. The language of the regulation in the statute is if the employee's child's regular place of care or school is closed, so the employee would still be entitled to use EFMLA. However, I'll add one caveat. The regulations, which is oddly conflicting with respect to the statute, but they do say that with respect to EFMLA, the employer can require, consistent with the employer's policy, the use of concurrent use of PTO or other accrued leave. So treat it the same way as the statute treats regular FMLA leave.
Thank you. Next question is, for public comment during meetings and have conducted public hearings with prior notice and instruction, we have had good results by requiring people to send emails with identifying information, having the email put into the record or having them read into the record if the emailer requests. Also, we allow the public the right to speak by email request and calling in, and then at the appropriate time, our IT people will verify their identity and allow them to be a speaker for that limited time. So that sounds like a suggestion.
Agreed.
Okay. Is there any objection to swim at your own risk sign?
No objection.
No objection. Thank you. Can you force someone to reveal their religion or belief?
No, you can't force someone to reveal their religion or belief. However, if someone requests an accommodation, the employer has the right to ask why, and the employee is required to state the reason why they're requesting an accommodation, whether it's because of disability or religion.
Thank you. Can employers require that employees stay at home for 14 days if they travel out of town?
I think they can, but I think then they're going to qualify under the new statute for the paid leave. So I think you can require it, but you're going to have to pay for it.
Require it, but you're going to have to pay for it. Are cities required to open to the public?
Yeah, so they're public spaces. The statute that I was just looking at actually during the before says that you can leave those emergency measures in place to close facilities for as long as it's reasonably necessary to uphold the public health and welfare, essentially. So I guess that's just a matter of when do we think that it's no longer necessary to close the public facility. And I think that's a pretty sensitive thing depending on what's going on in the world around us.
So this looks like it's for Gilbert. There's a couple questions, and Jay, this might be for you too. How did you determine 60 was the right number for your council chambers? And then the next question, which is very similar, how are you going to determine which 60 public will be able to attend if you usually have a full room at council meetings?
So I'll answer both questions at the same time. Regarding the number, we looked at, we actually physically walked the space. We had staff do that to space out the 6-foot requirements to determine what could be an appropriate capacity from that perspective. We also looked at our procedure for remote workforce. As I mentioned, our phase 1 is up to 25%. The reason why we went a little bit larger for the council chambers was because in our particular community, there is a strong desire to have in-person participation. And so we wanted to provide that capacity to do so while first making sure that we could maintain that physical distancing. So that's the threshold that we've set. It lands at about 30%. So we felt comfortable that that was still within the range of that first phase. And then the second question about who will be allowed within the chambers, it's a first come, first served basis. So the folks that are there first will be having staff who are counting as they come in. And then there are overflow seating options in the lobby, and then as well as a call-in option and an online option. So several different, as well as the TV option. So there's several different opportunities for folks to participate.
Excellent. So it's a first come, first serve then in terms of in person.
And Matt, I would just add, we took a very similar approach. The only thing I would add is that on our published public-facing council agendas, in bright red letters at the very top of the agenda, we explain the current conditions in terms of how to access the meeting, what alternative measures are in place. So anyone with an interest in the meeting, any source they would look at to find out about the meeting, they would see that information.
Thank you. This goes, I think, for Peoria and Gilbert. Have you found washable surgical masks?
No, I would just say my understanding of the surgical masks is they are what they say. They're built and intended for surgeons and people working in surgery. We've obviously adopted that use for something slightly different. So the guidance on a surgical mask is you wear it once. You perform, open heart surgery and you throw it away. We're not doing open heart surgery, so we've adapted that a little bit with some guidance from our own fire medical personnel, and that is wear it throughout the day unless it gets soiled or you sneeze on it or somebody else sneezes on it or you drop it in the, in the sink. Wear it a day and then throw it away.
Okay. Next question is, and this could be for anybody, have you received any pressure from your council or community to move back to physical delivery of services rather than online/digital? i.e., is there a perception that remote online service delivery really isn't as good as it was before?
I'll jump in first. There certainly are members of our community who feel like a physical service delivery is more optimal, or it's what they know and what they're used to, and we want to respect that. And in some cases, that is the case. We've got an example where our water conservation team does on-site water conservation audits. We can do a version of that online, but there's nothing like being there physically to perform that audit. So there are certain scenarios where we have worked really hard to bring back a physical delivery, but with these new safety mitigation controls in place to help provide for a better and safer environment. At the same time, we are absolutely encouraging our employees and our community and our council to continue to utilize some of the new and innovative ways we've adapted over the last 3 months and to lean on technology a little more. Technology isn't perfect. I think one of our first council meetings, we had some glitches with WebEx. We had a council financial retreat where WebEx went down, and we ended up having to reschedule the second portion of the retreat. Since then, we've put in backup methods to alleviate if technology fails on one area, we'll have a backup or even a third backup. So all that to say is absolutely people have mixed feelings about digital delivery of services. And we're just trying to demonstrate where it's appropriate. We want to absolutely expand on that, and where it doesn't make sense, we'll continue with the physical delivery.
Okay, thank you. This next couple questions is for you, Jay, and we can send this out when we send out all the materials. Would you mind sharing with us your Peoria's A to Z COVID-19 policy? And then the other one was, would you mind also sharing the journal articles that N95 useful for water and sewer service workers?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share those.
Okay.
I'll get those to Matt for distribution.
Great, and just so everybody knows just so everybody's aware, when they send that to me, we will include that with the link to this recording to all those who registered. For Gilbert in Peoria, the next question is, how often do you replace surgical masks provided to employees daily or on some other schedule?
Yeah, kind of like I said, it's those are for one-day use. So we've for areas that have requested them or where they're likely to be needed, we have pushed them out, and we restock them for daily use.
Similar in our community, we've provided for daily use, and in some cases, more than one mask a day in public safety and other high contact and high interaction with the public. We have also asked that our staff conserve them when they're not needed. So if you can maintain the physical distancing, you will have a mask that's available and provided for you. But if you can maintain it, then you may not need to wear it within your office.
Okay, thank you. Question, this could be for any of you. Is anyone providing masks to the public entering your facilities? If so, what type of masks do you provide? And do you have them sign a waiver to get the mask?
We are not currently, but we are actually, as we speak, our legal team is looking at a request from our dial-a-ride area to provide, upon request, surgical masks for passengers. That's an issue that has arisen, and we're currently taking a look at that. The considerations are kind of similar to what they were with our employees. Are our dial-a-ride drivers sufficient to train a passenger in how to use it properly? Is supply chain going to be a concern in terms of creating an expectation? So we haven't determined how we're going to handle that, but we're looking at that right now.
For Gilbert, we are providing surgical masks at public meetings for those who are showing up and may not have anticipated that they would want one. So we're making those available when we have a public meeting.
Okay, and then a question for Leah and Mary. Can you share your employee safety handbook that you mentioned? I don't know, do you have that in some type of link that we could provide?
We will later today.
Excellent, excellent. Would you mind then sharing that with me, and then we can include that in the documents? Okay.
There's a version that's posted to our website, and we'll share that as well.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, the last question is, can you provide Gilbert's reopening plan? So I think that covers that. All right, everybody. Well, thank you again to our speakers. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know it was short notice. And hold on, we got one more. We want to, there's a comment, we want to require surgical masks for entering public partly because we want to model the safety precaution for the community. So that was just a comment from someone. But again, thank you to everybody for being willing, especially our speakers, and to all the attendees. Thank you for taking the time. I know we went a little over the 2-hour mark, but I think this is information that we are all grappling with as cities and towns right now. And we really appreciate the knowledge that our speakers shared with us. We hope this was helpful to you. Again, we will send a link to this recording out, as well as all the handouts that you've requested to all those who have registered. So thank you, everybody. Again, have a great afternoon. Hopefully next time we see each other, it will be in person, and we will be past this COVID-19 virus. So thanks again. Have a great afternoon. Thank you, and be safe.
Thanks, everyone.